What if the most ordinary workday of your life ended with a sentence that shattered everything you thought you knew? Stay with this story, because what happens next will make you question fate, truth, and the price of walking away from the past. If you love emotional, twist-filled stories that hit hard and linger long after the final word, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't just entertain, they change you. Dr. Ethan Hale had learned to measure his days in heartbeats and paperwork, in the soft rise and fall of patients' chests and the relentless ticking of the clock above the exam room door, and on the Tuesday morning when everything changed, nothing felt unusual at first, not the pale winter light slipping through the blinds, not the scent of antiseptic clinging to his coat, not even the faint ache in his lower back that came from sleeping in a chair beside his daughter's bed after her nightmare the night before. Because Ethan was a single father first and a doctor second, no matter what the framed degrees on his wall claimed, and by the time the nurse knocked gently and said his next patient had arrived, he was already running 7 minutes behind and mentally apologizing to a waiting room full of strangers who had no idea how carefully he tried to hold their lives steady while his own felt like it was balanced on a thread, and the woman who stepped into his office looked like any other patient at first glance, mid-30s maybe, coat too thin for the cold, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't expected to see anyone today, her eyes darting briefly to the medical charts, the cabinets, the family photo on his desk of a smiling little girl missing one front tooth, and when she sat, she folded her hands tightly in her lap as if holding herself together took conscious effort, and Ethan noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her breathing seemed shallow, but he smiled anyway, the calm practiced smile that told people they were safe here, and introduced himself, asking what had brought her in, and she opened her mouth as if to answer but instead swayed, her eyes rolling back just enough for Ethan to register the danger before her body slumped forward. An instinct took over as he was out of his chair in a second, catching her before her head hit the desk, calling for the nurse, lowering her gently onto the exam table while his mind ran through possibilities, low blood sugar, dehydration, anxiety, something worse, and as he checked her pulse and airway, he felt a strange jolt of recognition he couldn't place, like a memory brushing past him too fast to grasp, and when she finally stirred minutes later, eyelids fluttering open as if waking from a deep, confusing dream, she looked at him with sudden sharp focus, her gaze locking onto his face with an intensity that made his chest tighten, and before he could reassure her, before he could ask how she felt or explain what had happened, she whispered hoarsely, "The baby is yours," and the words hung in the air like a dropped instrument in an operating room, impossible to ignore, impossible to understand, and Ethan actually laughed once, a short disbelieving sound, because patients said strange things when they fainted, because shock and confusion did that to the brain, because this woman was a stranger whose medical history he hadn't even read yet, but she didn't look confused, she looked terrified and certain all at once, and when he asked her to repeat herself, slower this time, she did, her voice steadier despite the tremble in her hands, and Ethan felt the room tilt, his professional composure cracking just enough for the man underneath to surface, the man who had learned the hard way that life could change in a single moment, because 7 years earlier there had been another moment, another woman, another sentence that had altered everything, a memory he kept locked away for the sake of his daughter and his sanity, and as he stared at the woman on the table, her eyes glossy but unwavering, the nurse hovering uncertainly by the door, he realized with a cold rush that this wasn't just a medical emergency, it was the beginning of something he wasn't prepared to face, something that reached back into his past and threatened to rewrite it, and while he forced himself to ask clinical questions, to check her vitals, to restore order to the room, his mind raced ahead to consequences, to headlines, to his daughter Lily waiting at home with her homework and her endless questions, to the fragile balance he'd built between being a good father and a good doctor, and when the woman finally gave her name, Mara, there it was again, that jolt of recognition sharpening into something darker, something closer to fear, because he had known Amara once, long before he wore a white coat every day, back when hope was reckless and mistakes felt survivable, and as she watched his face change, as understanding dawned slowly and painfully between them, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that whatever truth lay behind her words, fainting spells and test results were the least of his worries now, because some revelations didn't just ask to be examined, they demanded to be lived through, no matter the cost. Ethan closed the exam room door himself after the nurse left, the soft click sounding louder than it should have, sealing them into a space that suddenly felt too small for the weight of what had been said, and he told himself, again, that this was shock, coincidence, a cruel trick of memory, yet when Mara pushed herself upright and met his eyes, the years collapsed between them in a way no logic could stop, because she wasn't just familiar now, she was unmistakable. The curve of her cheekbones, the tiny scar near her left eyebrow he remembered from a night spent laughing under broken streetlights, the way she used to look at him when she wanted him to believe something before she said it, and the doctor in him demanded distance, demanded evidence, demanded that he slow this moment down to a manageable pace. But the man, the single father who measured risk in the fragile sleep of his child, felt the ground sliding, and he asked her how long she'd known she was pregnant, the question sounding clinical and hollow even to his own ears, and Mara answered quietly that she'd known for weeks, that she hadn't fainted because of the pregnancy itself but because she hadn't eaten properly in days, because stress had a way of stealing hunger first, and as she spoke, her words tumbled out faster, as if once begun they could no longer be contained, telling him she hadn't come here by accident, that she'd chosen his practice deliberately after seeing his name online and recognizing it instantly, that she'd sat in her car outside for nearly half an hour fighting the urge to leave, because saying the words out loud would make them real, and Ethan felt anger spark beneath his confusion, not loud anger, but the sharp, disciplined kind that demanded answers, and he asked why now, why him, why after all this time, and Mara swallowed hard before explaining that the man she'd been with, the man she'd believed was the father, had walked away the moment she told him she was pregnant, not with cruelty but with certainty, because he'd had a vasectomy years earlier, a fact she'd never known, and she'd laughed at first, convinced it was an excuse, until medical proof made denial impossible, and it was only then, lying awake night after night replaying the past, that Ethan's face had risen unbidden in her mind, along with a memory she'd buried out of fear and pride, a memory of a night 7 years ago when their lives had intersected briefly and intensely, a night neither of them had intended to mean more than it did, except that it had, and as she spoke, Ethan's own memory filled in the gaps with brutal clarity, the conference in Chicago, the celebration after passing his boards, the drink that turned into 3, the way Mara had seemed like an escape from the pressure he'd been under, brilliant and warm and unattached, the way they'd promised to keep it simple, the way he'd left before sunrise with the unshakable belief that simplicity was a choice, and now she was sitting in his office telling him simplicity had been a lie, and Ethan stood and turned toward the sink, washing his hands though they were already clean, buying himself seconds to breathe, to remember that he was a physician sworn to care, not accuse, and when he turned back, he asked the question he feared most, if she was certain, and Mara nodded, explaining that timelines didn't lie, that dates narrowed possibilities down to one man, and as much as she wished it weren't him, as much as she tried to convince herself she was wrong, the truth kept resurfacing, relentless, and Ethan felt a familiar ache spread behind his eyes, the ache that came when the carefully ordered life he'd built threatened to unravel, because Lily was 8 now, old enough to sense when something was wrong, old enough to ask why her father suddenly stared into space at dinner, and the thought of introducing chaos into her world made his chest tighten, and yet, even as fear surged, another emotion crept in uninvited. Responsibility, because he knew what it was to grow up with unanswered questions, to wonder if someone had chosen absence, and he would not be that man, not again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady in a way that surprised him, telling Mara they would take this one step at a time, that assumptions weren't proof, that tests existed for a reason, and she agreed quickly, relief flashing across her face as if she'd been bracing for rejection, and as he scheduled blood work and an ultrasound referral, not as her doctor, he insisted, but as someone helping her find answers. Ethan felt the duality of his roles collide, because every form he filled out was shadowed by the possibility that his daughter might soon have a sibling she never asked for, that his quiet evenings might be replaced by something louder and messier and irrevocably permanent, and when Mara stood to leave, pausing by the door as if unsure whether to say more, she whispered that she hadn't come for money or forgiveness, only truth, and as she left, Ethan sank into his chair, staring at the empty space she'd occupied, realizing that the hardest part wasn't proving whether the baby was his, but facing what he would do if it was, because some tests didn't just reveal facts, they revealed who you really were. The days between the tests and the results stretched into something heavier than time, each hour weighted with possibility, and Ethan discovered that uncertainty was far more exhausting than certainty had ever been, because certainty, even when painful, allowed movement, while this limbo forced him to live in 2 futures at once, one where Mara's words were a mistake born of fear and coincidence, and another where they were true and his life was already changing in ways he hadn't yet found language for, and he moved through his routines like a man underwater, smiling for patients, signing charts, picking Lily up from school and listening attentively as she explained in great detail why her class pet turtle needed a name more dignified than Speedy, all while a quiet voice in his mind kept counting weeks, replaying dates, aligning memories he'd long since archived as irrelevant, and when the call finally came from the lab confirming that the preliminary bloodwork showed a genetic probability too high to dismiss, Ethan sat alone in his office long after the clinic had closed, the city lights blinking on outside his window as if nothing monumental had just occurred, and he felt grief before joy, mourning the simplicity of the life he'd been clinging to, because he knew now there was no going back to the man he'd been before Mara fainted in his office, no unhearing the words that had cracked his carefully constructed calm, and when the definitive DNA results arrived days later, confirming beyond reasonable doubt that he was the father, the finality hit him not like a blow but like a slow, deep settling, the way a truth sinks into bones and becomes part of how you stand, and he called Mara himself, his voice steady but stripped of pretense, telling her he knew, telling her he wanted to meet somewhere neutral, not a clinic or a courtroom but a place where they could speak as two people facing the same irreversible fact, and they chose a quiet cafe near the river, the kind of place where conversations were absorbed into background noise and nobody paid much attention to the tremble in your hands. And when Mara arrived, visibly further along now, a softness rounding her face that hadn't been there before, Ethan stood instinctively, an action that surprised them both, and they talked for hours, not about blame but about reality, about how fear had shaped their choices, about how neither of them had imagined standing here years ago discussing co-parenting schedules and prenatal appointments, and Mara admitted through tears that she'd expected resistance, lawyers, distance, because that was what experience had taught her to expect from men when consequences arrived, and Ethan surprised himself by admitting that part of him had wanted to run, not because he doubted the truth but because he doubted his ability to protect everyone involved, especially Lily, whose world was already fragile after losing her mother to illness years before, and it was Lily who ultimately anchored his decision, because when he finally told her, carefully, gently, sitting on the edge of her bed with the nightlight glowing softly, she listened in silence before asking if the baby would need bedtime stories too, and when he said yes, she nodded solemnly and declared that she could help, because families, in her understanding, expanded rather than broke, and in that moment Ethan felt something inside him loosen, the fear giving way to resolve, and months later, when the baby was born on a rain-soaked morning that felt impossibly similar to the one when Lily had entered his life, Ethan stood beside Mara not as a savior or a rescuer but as a father, cutting the cord with hands that didn't shake, realizing that the unbelievable discovery he'd dreaded had become an undeniable truth he could live with, and as he held his newborn son for the first time, feeling the small, fierce grip of a life that carried pieces of his past and his future at once, Ethan understood that fate hadn't ambushed him in his office that day. It had returned something he hadn't known he was ready to claim, and sometimes the most terrifying words you ever hear are simply an invitation to become more than you were.